Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and very well welcome to the new video, which is part of our faculty series. Today I have an immense pleasure to interview Professor Gabriella Citroni. Professor Citroni is a faculty member of the Geneva Academy, where she teaches enforced disappearances in international law. She's also a professor of international human rights law at the University Milano Bicocca in Italy and a senior legal advisor at Trial International. Professor Citroni is also an international legal advisor at the Latin American Federation of Associations of Relatives of Disappeared People and a vice president of the United Nations Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances, which I will call from now onwards only the working group. Welcome, Professor Citroni.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you for having me.
So thank you for accepting, for being here with us and for discussing the issue of enforced disappearances, which is something that you have been working on extensively in the past years. So basically, what I will be addressing today is I want to get some answers from you, as from your experience as working on this issue of enforced disappearance, as a scholar, as an activist, and also as a member of the working group. And my very first question would actually be whether you could explain to us what does enforced disappearance mean, as I think it's a term that is not really familiar to everyone. And at the same time, what precisely had made you so passionate about this issue, about this crime?
Okay, thank you. Because I'm used to answer to this in multiple languages. Apart from Spanish, there is usually a reaction that is puzzlement. It's like, what is this? Enforced disappearance? Is this unknown beast? And when I repeat that in Spanish and I say desaparecidos, there is usually a reaction. And people do think of a very specific area of the world and of a very specific point in time. So military dictatorships, mostly in South America. That is true. That is enforced disappearance. And I'll come back to this in a second, although it's at the very same time misleading, because enforced disappearance is something that continues happening. It's actually happening at the very same moment while we're speaking. And there is, unfortunately, no area in this world that can be regarded as enforced disappearance free. So I can give you the legal answer to what is an enforced disappearance, where we would consider that there is a person who is deprived of his or her liberty against their will. This is usually done by state actors, state agents, forces of the state, that are directly or indirectly involved in this. So also in cases where we do have paramilitary groups that may be the perpetrators. And what really is unique to enforced disappearance is that this deprivation of liberty is followed by a complete denial. Denial that the deprivation of liberty took place, denial in some cases that the person even existed, and the concealment of the fate or whereabouts of the disappeared person. What happens next is that the person is placed outside the protection of the law, in what we could regard as a legal limbo. Now, this is the legal definition. Picture this in human terms. Enforced disappearance is a very complex violation that, of course, hits the disappeared person, but actually targets multiple victims. The relatives, who are caught between hope and despair, not knowing what happened to their loved one, but depending on the profile of the person, also the social group, maybe fellow students. Basically, enforced disappearance is actually perpetrated to really create a state of terror among the highest possible number of persons. There are multiple perpetrators, multiple victims, multiple human rights violated. It's something that triggers questions that a person would ask himself or herself for the rest of their life if they do not find out the truth. So it is something that has several legal implications, but a chilling human effect in human life. One last thing I would like to specify is the profile of the victims. If we think of where I started, so the traditional enforced disappearances, you would think of protesters, human rights defenders, political opponents, and that is true. That was true then, that unfortunately remains true today. But enforced disappearance is such a complex crime, usually granted a fair amount of impunity, that therefore morphs over time. So today there are also different victims, including children. It's used in where anti-terror legislation is applied. And today we also do have enforced disappearance in the context of migration. So unfortunately, there remains a lot to be done to effectively prevent this crime.
I think by giving this answer, you've actually already clarified why you became so passionate about this subject, since it's very clear that one just cannot stay indifferent towards this.
Yeah. I skipped that because I don't have a precise answer to that, in the sense that circumstances in life brought me to working on the subject. At first, I was writing my undergraduate thesis, so I just became passionate on the subject. And then I moved for a program. My first job was in Peru, where I started working with relatives of disappeared persons. And from then, the rest is history. I wrote my PhD thesis on that. And there was an ongoing negotiation of what today is known as the International Convention on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. And the Italian delegation allowed me to participate as a legal advisor. So, as I said, the rest is history, but is circumstances. What I know is that I couldn't picture myself working on a different subject tomorrow, let's say. I wish, because this would mean that we have been effective in tackling the issue.
So now, actually, since 2021, you are also a member of the working group, as I already mentioned, which means you are contributing in a specific manner. And what I want to emphasize is that we usually refer to this working group as having a humanitarian mandate. So could you clarify what precisely this entails, and also maybe at the same time share whether you think that this working group is important for the relatives of the victims of enforced disappearances?
The working group was created in 1980. And it was one of the very first spatial procedures. And in fact, when it was created, and the very reason why states at the time allowed its creation was that it was labeled as a humanitarian body. What does this mean in practice? And we remain mostly, although not solely that, as of today. It means that we act as a channel of communication between families and states. We receive allegations that an enforced disappearance occurred, and after checking what we are receiving, we would turn to the state with, I think, the weight that comes with being the United Nations, asking to the state where the person is, what is the state of health of the person, why, if the person has been deprived of his or her liberty, why is that, where is the person being held, and in case the person is dead, where are the mortal remains? We would afterwards act, as I said, in between the relatives or the sources of the cases that could also be NGOs and the state, transferring the kind of information we received. And we remain seized of a case until we are satisfied that the fate and whereabouts of the disappeared person have been clarified. Are we important? Not to me to say this, but I would think so. First of all, because we have this competence for all the states in the world. So even for those states that might not be so keen on ratifying and undertaking international obligations by ratifying other treaties, we remain a door which relatives can turn and knock at. And we basically answer 24 hours, 7 days a week. I think that for families, it is important to know that there is someone in Geneva somewhere that is looking into their case and supporting them as much as we can. I have to be honest, on our side, it is also sometimes very frustrating because you would like to be doing much more, to deliver much more. But this is not a short-term engagement, and this requires a lot of patience, perseverance, and engagement, I would say.
And do you think that the working group also has a role in preventing future enforced disappearances?
Yes. Today, as I was saying, we started as a purely humanitarian mandate. Today, we would say that we have two main functions. On the one hand, the humanitarian, that still remains, and in percentage, remains the majority of our work. But we also do have what we call a monitoring mandate. Because in 1992, we are about to turn, the instrument is about to turn 30 in December this year. The Declaration on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance was adopted. That became our legal instrument of reference, and therefore we monitor that states do implement what is enshrined in that declaration. By monitoring that, we accompany states, hopefully helping them also enhancing their legislation, which is conducive to prevention, but also calling on them when we are aware of the existence of obstacles in the implementation of that declaration, and hopefully, again, supporting more structural changes to prevent enforced disappearances from happening.
And one of the things that I've heard is that the working group is currently working on a topic of technology, basically, digital technology and enforced disappearances. So I'm quite curious whether you could share, on the one hand, what does role technology have in perpetrating enforced disappearances, and on the other hand, documenting enforced disappearances, and which aspect the study of the working group will address.
We are ambitious, so we aim at actually covering at least three aspects. But let's give a step backwards. We decided to look into the subject, I would say 1 year ago, and we started holding some expert consultations to really grasp what does this entail. When we say new technologies, you can be very broad or tend to narrow down the definition. We wanted to stay as broad as possible, so it would be digital technologies, but also other kind of whatever technologies that are so fastly evolving would offer today. And through receiving inputs from experts, but also based on the experience, on the daily experience of the working group, on the kind of cases we receive, we document. We identified three main areas where this interaction is interesting and should be studied, and recommendations seem to be in order. On the one hand is how enforced disappearance can actually be facilitated by new technologies. We receive a significant number of cases where the disappeared person, before being forcibly disappeared, has been subjected to digital surveillance, has been the subject of a spyware attack. So we are fairly confident that we can allege there is a clear link in the use of these kind of tools and the perpetration of enforced disappearance. If not the perpetration per se, the same kind of techniques are used to reach a chilling effect on civil society and human rights defenders. Often relatives, members of civil society organizations are also subjected to the same kind of practices. And these days, we are seeing a use, I would say a vicious use of internet shutdowns in situations where enforced disappearances occur. We could clearly trace that when there is a shutdown in a country, immediately afterwards, the number of cases of enforced disappearances we receive increases significantly. There's so much so that we think it's important to really pinpoint this kind of situations. This is, let's say, the bad phase of new technologies vis-a-vis enforced disappearances. But we wanted to focus also on two rather positive aspects of new technologies. New technologies today can be instrumental in searching effectively for disappeared person and finding them, hopefully alive. Satellite imagery, CCTV cameras, if used properly, and if these tools that do not cost something unaffordable, I would say, for any state force in the world, but even for civil societies, if they are used properly, they could be instrumental in really finding and establishing promptly the fate and whereabouts of disappeared persons. Similarly, new technologies can be actually used to document and to preserve evidence on the perpetration of enforced disappearance, and therefore they could become instrumental in the promotion of accountability of perpetrators in trials, be it at the domestic, international, regional level.
Thank you. Well, I'm very much looking forward to see the new study. And my last question, Professor Citroni, would be regarding your course at the Academy. So I would be interested to know, since basically the phenomenon of enforced disappearance is so complex, is whether you focus on a specific aspect or from a specific angle of international law that you study this issue, and also whether the course has managed to inspire any of your students to continue working on the issue.
Okay, first of all, I have to thank all the students that have crossed my path in the course over these years. I have to say this, no offense to students back in Italy, but this is the course I prefer to teach and I fancy the most. I've really come across bright and clever minds that tend to become passionate about the subject. So this is the reason why I like to teach this subject, to raise awareness. But also I was blessed by the fact that several students afterwards actually either are working at the UN level in one of the different bodies or even cooperated with me in NGOs. Some are dealing with the issue at the ICRC. So I've crossed their paths again in a professional life, and I hope that what they studied during the course was of some use and sparked their interest in the subject. What I have to say, and I have to admit, and take this opportunity to actually apologize to the students, is that enforced disappearance is so complex, legally speaking, that I always struggle to really try to cover or even provide hints of what should be looked at in the number of hours at my disposal. So over the years, I've subjected students to inhuman and degrading treatment, and I have to admit this. But enforced disappearance is really at the crossroads between international humanitarian law, international human rights law, international criminal law. So I try at least to cover and provide elements on the three of them.
Well, thank you, Professor Citroni, for this fascinating and inspiring interview. I think that your passion transmits at every moment when you speak about the issue. And thank you also for watching. I hope you enjoyed as much as we did.
Thank you.